welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear, where the republishing of a fantastic book about 10cc has reminded Dave and I of various things. One is, and here is the book, one is A, how fond we were of their records back in the day, B, how many we still have, and C, how often we still play them, and D, what a cracking story this is. And to that end, we are extending a warm digital welcome to the author of this book, Liam Newton. Liam, lovely to see you.
Hi, guys. Lovely to be on the podcast. Thanks for having
me. And where
me.
are you? You're in North London. Where are you?
I'm dialing in from St Albans in Hertfordshire.
Oh, right. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Very, very good. And this is, it's a terrific story. And it was originally published, I think it came out in about the year 2000.
Correct.
And this is a republishing, an update of the book. So what compelled you to write? Why did you want to write it in the first place? It's a great story.
I think in the first place, it was because I've always felt that they're kind of the unsung heroes of British pop music. When I started writing it back in the mid-90s, there were no books on 10cc. And it was, as you say, it's a great story, not only for their time in the 70s as 10cc, but obviously there's a lot to the story before and after their time with 10cc. And when you put it all together, their contribution to pop music over the last 50 years has been immense. So that was the genesis for the book. The book came out in 2000. Then about 5 years ago, it was out of print, and I decided to do an updated version, which I thought would be a fairly quick exercise. But it ended up in the doorstop that you've got here, because it's a big 500-page.
It's a very significant tome.
Yes, exactly.
It's weighty.
So, is this the official book? Can we say this? Is that how you describe it?
I think to as much as there ever will be an official book, I got to meet and interview Kevin Godley, Eric Stewart, Graham Gouldman, both for the first version and then the updated version. I interviewed Harvey Lisberg, the manager. I've sort of interviewed the key guys. The only person I couldn't get on board was Lol Cream.
Why?
I don't know. First time around, he was in Los Angeles doing other things. This time around, he just turned down the offer of getting involved. I don't necessarily know why.
You'd think if the other three had done it, you'd just be naturally curious and slightly anxious, actually, about what they might have said about you. There was a reason to have a look,
And this time, I also, for the updated version, I sort of went to meet Aubrey Powell, the Hypnosis co-founder, because obviously their sleeves for 10cc were part of the whole story.
Absolutely.
And even went back to interview Jonathan King for the stories around the origin of the band.
A big part of it, my goodness, yeah.
So I guess it's as official as it could be.
Could you give us just a very brief recap of what the four of them were doing beforehand? Because it's really interesting, isn't it? So Eric Stewart was, in the Mindbenders, wasn't he?
Yeah, Eric Stewart was successful from about the age of 19 onwards. He joined Wayne Fontana and the Mindbenders back in 1963. He had a very lucky break. He was sitting in a coffee shop in Manchester, and Wayne Fontana was due to audition, and his band didn't turn up. So Wayne Fontana ran into the coffee room and said, look, he knew Eric played guitar. I think the drummer hadn't turned up either. And with this makeshift backing band, they did an audition for Jack Baverstock at Philips Records, got the recording contract, and then very quickly had a number of big hits. The Game of Love probably is the most famous one. There's the song 6 times, which was the other big hit that they had. Yeah. And then Wayne left the group, and then they achieved one of these rare feats where they had a massive hit with the first record they released without him, which was Groovy Kind of Love, which was a huge hit both sides of the Atlantic. So Eric had done that, and then when the Mindbenders had finished, he set up Strawberry Studios in Manchester, which is the first time really there was a successful studio outside of London. Meanwhile, Graham Gouldman had been a songwriter, one of the great songwriters of the 60s. He'd written hits for the Yardbirds, For Your Love, Heart Full of Soul, Evil Hearted You, Bus Stop, Look Through Any Window for the Hollies, No Milk Today, for Herman's Hermits, Jeff Beck, Cher. He was just on fire, but he couldn't actually. He was in a band with Kevin Godley. They couldn't get their own band to be successful, but Graham was writing these massive hits. And meantime, Godley and Cream were art students. Effectively, they were interested in art. They were playing in bands together, and slowly the four of them really got together towards the end of the 60s at Strawberry Studios. and started to become the house band there for sort of 2 or 3 years before they ended up forming the band.
Frab Joy and the Runcible Spoon or something, and they got
Graham
and Eric to come and help, and then that was the four of them working in Strawberry.
Correct. 1969 was the first time they worked together, and then Graham got a contract for hire with, if you remember, Kaznet's Cats, the sort of originators of bubblegum music. And he went over to New York to do some writing for them, and eventually got fed up with it and said to them, "Look, I've got a studio back in Manchester with some mates. Why don't we record the songs there?" And really the 3-4 months that they spent recording and churning out a lot of, instantly forgettable, but occasionally, memorable tracks was really, a key part in the formation of 10cc, because they got to turn their hand at lots of different musical styles, in that kind of era. And then you had all sorts of people coming into the studio, like Neil Sedaka. I think David was showing
I've got it here.
The Neil Sedaka sessions.
Oh, is that not Solitaire? What was the record he made with it?
Yeah, they recorded 2 albums together, Solitaire and then The Trial Days Are Over, which revived Neil Sedaka's career. And it was actually Neil Sedaka that said to them while they were recording the second album, you guys should form a band. And they've been doing stuff in downtime, but it was really probably Sedaka, that suggestion that was the gestation for 10cc.
So that then leads us to a series of visual aids I've got here. That leads us to the first 10cc album, which comes after. I mean, Donna was the breakthrough, wasn't it? This was it was like a doo-wop pastiche, wasn't it? That just turned out to be a huge hit. Tell us about that.
They wrote it as a B-side. They were originally looking at Waterfall as the first single. So Godley and Cream wrote it in about half an hour as a throwaway B-side, and they, it was a piss take, nothing more than that. And then when they were recording it, they realised it had a commercial potential of its own, and they sent it down to Jonathan King, who'd been following Eric Stewart around when he was in the Mindbenders, and it was actually Jonathan King that said, "That sounds like a hit. I'll sign you up to UK Records," which was the label he'd launched at the time.
Sounds incredibly like "Oh Darling" by the Beatles.
Yes, I think Paul McCartney has over the years ribbed Eric Stewart about that, around pinching one of the tracks, I think. But yes, it's an affectionate
when they went on Top of the Pops, wasn't there? Because they had kind of no image.
That's right.
At that time, it was all kind of glam rock, and everybody had an image, a visual image. They just went on wearing kind of denim shirts.
Yeah, and Tony Blackburn, I think, said to them that night, what a great image. You've got no image. It was almost like it had been part of a plan. But yeah, that was the first hit, went to number 2, and then they decided to keep the band going. In the meantime, Jonathan King had named them 10cc, which isn't the apocryphal story of that you've heard around the average male ejaculation actually isn't the correct story. It's probably one that's just gathered momentum over time. But actually, he just had a dream that he saw this band. He was looking at the Billboard chart in America, number one, and at number 1 in the album and singles chart was a band called 10cc. And he liked it because it had a combination of letters and numbers and was easy to read on the chart. Phoned them the next day and said, "I've got your name," and they said, "Great, we'll be 10cc." It's been embellished over the years, but that's the less interesting true story.
Jonathan King still gets a huge royalty out of 10cc, doesn't he? I think
he did an amazing negotiation.
4% deal or something.
Exactly. He not only did he get an incredible deal on the original 2 albums that they recorded, but when they signed with Phonogram, he negotiated 4% of all future royalties at that point. So, I'm Not in Love goes to number 1 in America, or in the UK, number 2 in America. And Jonathan King's, there's a great press ad that he wrote. He took out some press ads in the American press that said, "Congratulations to 10cc and Phonogram on the success of I'm Not in Love. It's a great record." And then it says, ... and thanks. And the "and thanks" bit was for the 4% that he'd received on that and all future records.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they had a very curious position, though, didn't they? Which I'm reminded of by looking on the back of this first album, where it says, "I'd love to hear a 10cc album, John Peel, disc, March 1973." As if, could you ever imagine a 10cc album? What a strange thing that would be, And I think that's quite interesting because what it illuminates is the fact that they were a unique group, weren't they? They were one of those groups with no antecedents and no successors,
Completely.
It's just Absolutely. A curious melding of talents. And they just did certain jobs, didn't they? Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think that's what's one of the things that makes them unique. Usually in bands there's a key songwriter or a front man or a guitarist that gives the band a signature sound. But really 10cc had, four incredibly talented, people in the band. They could all write, they could all sing. They had their own in-house engineer because Eric owned the studio. So he was engineering and mixing. They were all producers. And they talk about almost auditioning for each song that they recorded. They recorded each song one at a time, completely finished, and then moved on to the next song. They didn't record all the drum tracks and then add to them. And so I think every song almost sounds like a bit of a different band as a result of that. If you think about their 3 number 1 hits with Rubber Bullets, I'm Not in Love, and Dreadlock Holiday, unless you really knew, you'd be very hard to sort of pick out that that's the same band behind those 3 records. And I think it's one of the things I personally love about them, because every record was so different. It's possibly one of the things over time that hasn't worked so well for them in terms of their enduring anonymity, maybe because they don't have that image or that signature sound. Yeah. And unless you join the dots, you don't necessarily sort of see everything in the round. But you're right, it was a unique blending of talents.
What was the nearest equivalent? I can't think of any group that's even remotely like it, apart from vaguely Steely Dan.
Well, they're the group that they used to be oddly compared to. Because, and I think that was only because this like 1975 or whatever, 75, 76, because they were both very clever. Whereas 10cc, a slightly different kind of cleverness.
Yeah.
And Steely Dan more hipster clever. They were, but that was the comparison that was often drawn, So I remember what happened with 10cc was when they were coming up and they were having these huge hits, it was very groovy to like them. And then as soon as they were established, it was not groovy to like them.
Absolutely.
That's what seemed to happen. Tell us about I'm Not in Love, because I think you say in the book that probably on more than one occasion, it was voted the best record ever or something like that. Tell us about that. Was that Radio 1 or 92?
It was actually the first time it was Capital Radio when they used to do their sort of all-time lists. I think it was on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, 1976 was the first time it was voted number 1. It would by the nation. It came number 1 for about 4 or 5 years consistently in those popularity polls, and then I think Radio 1 had done a much bigger poll of about 100,000 people, and I'm Not in Love was there. So I think for a long time it was, it laid claim to be the nation's favourite record, probably for 5, 6, 7 years.
So it was the Bohemian Rhapsody of its day, was it?
Yeah,
it was.
Yeah, and I think even in
that whole thing where they had that kind of choir of voices and at that time you could do that now immediately, obviously on a synthesizer, but they had reel-to-reel tapes all over the studio, didn't they? Trying to just track all these voices in. Amazing.
I mean, I think it was it's a great example of the 4 of them working together, because Eric and Graham had written a song. As you probably know, they'd had a go at recording it, which they dismissed because Kevin Gouldman
it had a very difficult birth, didn't it?
It was it was a much more straight version, and then they decided to come at it again. And Kevin Godley had this idea of creating this angelic choir of sound, almost like in 2001: A Space Odyssey, that kind of sound that you get from those voices.
Yeah.
And they all said, well, that's great, but how the hell do we do that? And Lol Cream came up with the idea of using tape loops. And they created this choir of 256 voices by recording each sound, in the chromatic scale. And basically, if you can imagine it, they were recording this on a 16-track machine. The first 12 tracks had a different chromatic note in the scale of these voices, that when you lifted 3 notes up, you got a chord and did those things. So it required all 4 of them around the mixing desk to move the faders in time with the track. And then they added some other bits and pieces to it, but it's a landmark record. I think even now, it still has the ability to send shivers down my spine as a record.
Yeah, you talk about all those people, Brian Ferry and Elton John and Dave Grohl and Mike Mills, Billy Joel, and all these people reacting to it and saying it was absolutely life-changing. It's really interesting.
Absolutely. And I think, as you say, you could do that very easily today, with a sampler and a synthesizer, but it wouldn't sound the same. No. There was only one I'm Not in Love choir, and that's the one that they took them 3 weeks to record just those voices. So great record.
And presumably they were hugely advantaged by the fact that with Eric Stewart, they effectively had a producer and an engineer in the band, didn't they?
Correctly, absolutely, and he ended up, he was nominated for a Grammy Award. I think at the time he was very much seen as one of the leading studio engineers in the country. Became an in-demand producer in his own right. But I think, having their own studio, there was no clock at Strawberry Studios. They never wanted to be constrained by, it's 5 to 7, we'll leave the guitar solo as it is. They could spend as much time there as they wanted.
Yeah.
And I think that, and also in Stockport, well away from the centre of the music business. So they were a completely self-contained unit. You didn't have an A&R man from the studio knocking on the door going, have you recorded the single yet? They would record their stuff and then present it to the record company.
Yeah. So what were you going to say, Mike?
Peak, do you think, the original soundtrack? Was that the one you dug out just a minute ago, Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Do you think that was the high point? Because that had "I'm Not in Love" on it. I think it had Minestrone, didn't it? And We Are Paris, etc.
I think it's definitely it certainly is a peak. It's a commercial peak, certainly. I think the general consensus seems to be the album before Sheet Music is the creative peak. I don't know whether you've been listening to the Tim Burgess listening parties.
No, I haven't. Go on. Have they done this one?
Yeah, so Kevin Godley's been dialing into those, and we've done there's one on sheet music and one on original soundtrack.
Oh,
and I think the original members of 10cc would probably all say that they feel sheet music was the moment when they were just on fire, because if you look at the credits to that album, every songwriting combination between any two band members is used there. There's Stewart Gouldman songs, there's Stewart Cream songs, there's Gouldman Godley songs, and there's some brilliant, obviously famous songs on there like Wall Street Shuffle, but two of their best album tracks, if people haven't heard them, then Somewhere in Hollywood and Old Wild Men, are up there. They're absolute gems. And so I think that's probably the creative.
You're quite right about Old Wild Men. I was listening to that yesterday. That is a record completely ahead of its time.
Beautiful record, completely ahead of its time.
And it refers to sort of ancient rockers in their rocking chairs, pretty much. I was very grateful to your book for establishing that this picture was taken in the foyer of the Wood Green Odeon.
Yes,
where my wife and I went on our first date many years ago. I wasn't aware of that until reading your book.
Very good.
So when did they kind of come apart?
Just after Nebworth, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah, I think they recorded their fourth album, How Dare You, which had been a big success, and lots of great tracks on there, like Mandy Fly Me, another one of their kind of signature sounds. I think Godley and Cream had invented this attachment called the Gizmo, which was an attachment that sat on the bridge of the guitar, and it basically you could create infinite sustain by doing it. So with a lot of special effects in an expensive studio, with lots of multi-tracking, you could make it sound like an orchestra and other things. And in fact, that's the haunting sound on Old Wild Men, is the sound of the Gizmo. It's quite a unique sound. They wanted the Gizmo to be the next 10cc album to be kind of Gizmo focused. Eric and Graham didn't see it like that. And it was one of these crazy situations where there was pressure on them to release an album every sort of 9 to 12 months. And rather than just taking a year out and Godley and Cream getting it out of their system and recording what became Consequences, this sort of triple album that became one of the this folly, if you like, they were forced to leave. And I think when they look back now, when I talk to Kevin Godley and Graham Gouldman, both sides of the equation, they deeply regret it, I think, because they could have had a year out. Godley and Cream could have got it out of the system, and then very easy to pick up 10cc again. And had they continued in that original incarnation, I think they would have been much bigger as a proposition than perhaps they're remembered for today. But it was the Gizmo that was really the thing that pulled them apart, effectively.
And it was quite an agonising split, wasn't it? I think Godley and Gouldman were been in primary school together, I think, and Stewart and Cream were actually brothers-in-law, weren't they?
Correct. They were married, so it was a very difficult split. Yeah, and they're still, Eric and Lola still married to sisters. So they see a lot of each other, and actually, Kevin and Graham are still quite friendly. So it was quite a difficult split, and as you'll know at the time, lots of bad blood in the music press, and lots of jibes about 5cc. When Eric and Graham decided to sort of continue themselves. But it's a real shame.
Well, they were held as representative of everything that was kind of wrong with music at the time, unfairly, very unfair.
Correct, absolutely, yeah.
But they did continue to have success, didn't they?
Huge success. And I think that is one of the things I wanted to sort of explore a little bit in the book, because there is a perception that it all finished in 1976 for them. And obviously, everyone would agree the first four albums with the original lineup are the pinnacle of 10cc. But I have to say that a lot of, certainly in the first couple of years post the split, Deceptive Bends, which is the first album they recorded themselves, is a really fine album. Did very well, good critical notices, and actually good, commercial success. The Things We Do for Love, the first record they released off of that album, became the biggest selling record, more than I'm Not in Love. And then Bloody Tourist was again a good album with some, with Dreadlock Holiday on it, which went back to #1. And really, they were, as a live entity, they were probably even stronger than the original band. They had a very good live group at that point. And unfortunately, Eric Stewart's car accident at the beginning of 1979 really was the thing that derailed 10cc Mark II, because he nearly died in the accident, and it took really 9 months, 12 months to get back on the saddle, and things had changed, and the dynamics in the band had changed. But yeah, for 2 or 3 years, 10cc went on to sort of probably even greater commercial success with Eric and Graham, while actually Kevin and Lowell were finding it quite hard because their first records hadn't been successful. But obviously, ultimately, Kevin and Lowell then went on to have a very successful career as video directors in the 80s.
Which is yet another unique feature, isn't it? The two members of a group. Can you think of another one? Two members of a group go off and become really big in another field entirely. But that was where they kind of started, wasn't it? Because they were art students. They were
correct.
They were visual people.
Absolutely, they'd always been cinema buffs, and if you listen to the music of 10cc, it's very, very cinematic. I think lyrically, if you listen to something like One Night in Paris, this 3-part operetta, you can visualize. You can see in your head the whole story.
It's really funny. I was listening to it the other day, and I can't think of another kind of a huge hit album that starts off with the sound of a bicycle, doesn't it? Yeah. It's a French policeman, isn't it? It's supposed to be cycling down the boulevard.
That's right.
It starts in the slowest possible way, doesn't it?
Completely.
The idea, we're going to put that right at the beginning.
It's such an irony that all those songs were such storytelling songs, and yet they were just before the video boom, really.
Yes, exactly right.
And they had in the group the two most accomplished video makers of later years. So it's extraordinary that they didn't get a chance to make films off those songs.
Absolutely. And Kevin, one of the things he said to me was he's amazed that they didn't spend more time, him and Lowell, thinking about the visual presentation of the band.
Yeah.
Because he says we've got all that, we had that in our locker, but we just didn't. We were just focused on the music. But as you say, they'd always had that kind of cinematic, mind. And when they got the chance to originally record a video or direct a video for one of their own records, it became one of these things. It was a record called An Englishman in New York, which wasn't necessarily a successful record in the UK, but it was seen by people like Steve Strange from Visage, who said, do you think they would do a video for us? And they did, Fade to Grey, Mind of a Toy. And then from there, Duran Duran, Girls on Film is probably, one of the iconic films from that time. Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Two Tribes, one of those, fantastic videos at the time. All the Police video, Every Breath You Take, Herbie Hancock, Rocket. It just, they were probably the preeminent video directors of their era. Plus their own videos for things like Cry, their own record, which was obviously a big success for themselves.
Yeah. I was saying to Mark yesterday, a thing that struck me is that the 3 Jewish members, which they never talked about, it seems to me. Whereas if anybody was launching a group nowadays with 3 Jewish members, that would be front and center, wouldn't it?
Their identity.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, Kevin Godley, when they were thinking about what to call themselves, Kevin Godley suggested 3 Yids and a Yock. You might be aware of that as the name.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
They called themselves that. And but you're right. And it's interesting. Songs like The Second Sitting for the Last Supper on the original soundtrack, they weren't conscious of religion. They were coming at it from a completely different perspective. But you're right. It'd be a very different story to say today. But they are one of the most successful, lots of successful Jewish musicians, but I think as a band, they were possibly one of the most successful. Absolutely.
It always fascinates me when we had Graham Gouldman on the Word podcast years ago, and he was telling about all the songs that he wrote that his dad came up with the titles for.
Yeah.
Up to Davis is one of his
exactly.
And I only realised in reading your book that Art for Art's Sake was a title. Art for art's sake, money for God's sake.
Exactly. He used to say, listen, boys, art for art's sake, money for God's sake, when they were kind of getting maybe a little bit carried away.
It's the kind of thing that a sitcom father would say, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
You can really imagine that. Now, no band ever thinks they made as much money as they should have done. How did it turn out for them? I mean, because they sold loads of records but didn't see a huge amount of money in the early days. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, certainly in the first 2 years. I think the contract they had with with Jonathan King, I mean, they had a royalty of 4%. That's where that number came from. And actually wrote a song about it. 4% of something is better than 10% of nothing blues, because whenever they tried to renegotiate with Jonathan, that's what he would say. I think it really changed when they then moved to Phonogram, because that's when there was a bidding war for them. They'd released sheet music. They were a hot property. And I think between Richard Branson was looking for his first signing on Virgin, and Phonogram, between the two of them, during the course of, I think it's January 75, they were consistently outbidding each other. So I think they were the first. I think there was something like $1 million transfer fee when they originally signed to Phonogram, and obviously a much bigger royalty.
Weren't they? Because they thought they would have done better in America. They were very regretful. I think they would have done better.
Yeah. They thought they'd signed with Richard Branson. I mean, I think they'd done the deal, and then they'd left power of attorney with the manager. And Eric and Lowell actually went to St. Lucia on holiday. And as Eric was coming down the plane steps, there was a phone call for him at the airport, and it was Richard Branson saying, "What have you guys done?
Why didn't you sign with me? I thought
and he said, I thought we had signed with you." And I think it's because allegedly Phonogram had come in and offered more money. Also, potentially had said you can do one album every 12 months rather than every 9 months. But I think Lowell Cream in particular is still pretty bitter about that. And and I think Atlantic we're gonna bankroll some of that. Ahmet Ektigan was gonna bankroll some of that for Atlantic. So that the Atlantic machine behind them in the US could have meant they had a bigger legacy there.
Yeah, but presumably the checks are still coming in regularly from PRS and whatever, because they must have a bunch of songs that are just rotated on the radio absolutely all the time, even all these years later,
and turn up in movies and in television work, don't they? I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of these things. Yes, you're right. The core hits, you hear them Radio 2. They're a staple on the Radio 2 playlist, and their records do still appear. I mean, they were in the Guardians of the Galaxy film. I'm Not in Love was, as you might remember, the start of that film. But they're in so many films. I mean, Dreadlock Holiday appeared in the Gavin and Stacey Christmas special last year. It's not just the sort of more famous songs. Some of the album tracks have appeared in some of the sort of US. One Night in Paris appeared recently in the Marvelous Mrs. Is it the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel or something?
Oh, right, okay, does it? Yeah.
So they crop up. So the legacy of the music lives on, even if the band,
Where can you see that in other bands? Are there any other bands that you think? I mean, can't think of any off the top of my head. If people say, well, they're obviously influenced by 10cc. I mean, it's quite a. And also because 10cc was so varied, weren't they?
Yes,
well,
exactly.
wasn't Graham Gouldman's son involved in signing The Feeling?
Yes, I think he was working for Universal at the time. I think had signed them or was looking to sign them. They didn't know who he was, and he was asking about who their influences were. And 10cc were a key influence, as you can hear in the music, can't you? When you took that first album, it's very, very clear. And I think what's interesting for me is when the first book came out, there was some interest in it, beyond the sort of the core fan base. But people are much more receptive this time around, to it. I think their reputation over the last 20 years has been improved. Now, I don't know whether that's because the Guilty Pleasures movement, when that started, when Sean Rowley started that, he was a big advocate of 10cc. And obviously then people feel less guilty about the music they love. You don't need to feel guilty about it. And then people like The Feeling and other bands started to cite them as an influence. But certainly, I think they've got a much better critical reputation now than they probably had 20 years ago, ironically.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
And also, they're one of those groups that somehow didn't have the kind of solid fan base, that a lot of other bands had. Mainly because they weren't particularly a kind of live idea, and also because the records are so varied. They didn't have a particular sound. As you said earlier, every single record seemed to sound unlike the one before.
Yeah. I think you had a relatively sizable fan base because they were. I think that were there, but I think over time, when the hits started to dry up, I think that fan base started to dissipate. It wasn't maybe as strong as some other bands, but you're right. I think unless the difficulty is joining all the dots between all these very diverse sounding records.
Do you know what they need? They need a documentary for streaming TV that tells their story. Is there one?
Yeah, there was one that was.
Oh, was that?
Yeah, well, not streaming TV, but BBC4 streamed a documentary 5 years ago, and again, that was another part of their renaissance because it's an hour long. All four of them contributed to the documentary, and it was probably the first time that their story was properly told, and it was very, very well received. By fans, but also by critics. People saying. There was one quote, I think, from The Guardian that said, "I've always been ever so embarrassed about liking 10cc. Having seen this documentary, I realised that I shouldn't be embarrassed about it because there's such a great story there." So I do think that documentary did play a key role in helping to get the message out maybe to a broader audience.
Yeah. So do they all speak?
Well, you've got the classic interband things, but basically Lol and Eric speak because, as I said, they're still happily married to sisters and see each other, pretty regularly. And Kevin and Graham still speak. And you're probably aware that Kevin and Graham actually recorded some new music together in 2006 under the banner of GG06 and created some 5 or 6 really great tracks, well worth listening to if you haven't heard it or anyone hasn't heard it. And occasionally Kevin because Graham is the one that's continued to tour as 10cc. And if you go to see them now, actually Kevin has started to create some video content for that. So the highlight, I think, of the live stage show now is you actually get Kevin Godley singing to Somewhere in Hollywood, which is this beautiful song that I mentioned off of sheet music. And the band play the music backing track live, but he's singing it, and also he's created some visuals around it. So there's probably 3 or 4 visual elements that Kevin's contributed to the sort of 10cc touring band, but really it's Kevin and Graham on one side and Eric and Lol on the other that are still in touch.
And they're all still active, aren't they? Well, actually, Eric's retired, I think. But I mean, Lol was part of that group, wasn't he, with Trevor Horn, or the producers I saw about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, and if you look at a lot of the projects Trevor Horn's involved with, you'll see Lol is on there in some capacity as a singer, as a musician, occasionally as a songwriter. Kate Bush, Robbie Williams, Pet Shop Boys. He's actually there in the small print. Kevin's got a new album coming out in December for his first ever solo album, age 75, called Muscle Memory. But it's if you listen to it, his lyrical, writing skills are as sharp as ever. I mean, some of the lyrics on the new record are, not what you would expect from someone in their dotage, and his voice still sounds fantastic. He's releasing each song ahead of the album in 2-week intervals. So there's about 9 that have been released so far ahead of the album coming out in December. Graham released a new solo album earlier this year. So they're all pretty active, apart from Eric, I think, that's officially retired.
Yeah.
So looking at all the things they've done, what for you is the highlight?
I think the highlight for me, I think it is I'm Not in Love. I know it's a bit of a cliche to say that, but I just think that if you want to try to capture the magic of 10cc in one song, a song that could only have, or a recording that could have only happened with input from all 4 of them, as I said, that is the record I think that will be their legacy. I think for anyone that is less familiar with their work, I would push them in the direction of sheet music, because I think that album just sounds so fresh today. I think Tim Burgess of the Charlatans, that has been doing the listening parties, his new record is very influenced by sheet music, and I think his producer said this sounds like 10cc era sheet music, and I think Tim had said that's the highest compliment you can pay. Interestingly, Lloyd Cole has come out recently. He's been listening to these listening parties, and actually he did a show recently with Stewart McConey, and he's been blown away by this track somewhere in Hollywood. He actually got Stewart to sort of play it recently on an interview that he did. He's been a bit obsessed with it in the lockdown period. So yeah, I would say sheet music is the pinnacle. If you haven't heard that album, I would encourage everybody to listen to that.
Well, it's funny you should mention Lloyd Cole, because we're talking to him tomorrow, aren't we?
Oh, brilliant!
We're talking to him tomorrow, so we'll mention that. We'll also suggest that if he's such a fan of 10cc, that he really needs to read your book, newly republished, extended, even more of a thumping great tone that it was in the past. 10cc, the worst band in the world, by Liam Newton. And Liam, it's been a delight talking to you.
Absolute delight. Thanks so much.
Been a pleasure.
You.
Thanks for having me.